So now I'd like to talk about the neurotransmitters in more depth, like about specific neurotransmitters. And I want to introduce two broad classes of neurotransmitters. And the first is a particular target of many, many drugs. Actually, many drugs of abuse actually target what we refer to as the classical neurotransmitters, particularly a subclass of these classical neurotransmitters called the monoamines. They also tend to target, for example, GABA. Alcohol, will target GABA, we will learn, and also, it turns out, will target a receptor that's associated with a neurotransmitter called glutamate. So when we refer to classical neurotransmitters, all this means, this is a historical reference, it just means that they were discovered first. There's nothing, all these neurotransmitters are chemicals. They're all going to be synthesized. They're all going to be broken down, right? But the difference between the classical and some of these others is that the classical were identified and were examined and were researched first. So the classical neurotransmitters include acetylcholine. We'll talk about acetylcholine. Drugs that actually help to improve memory, for example, have targeted the acetylcholine system. But it turns out that the same drugs have also been used as pesticides and also as toxic nerve gases. So we'll talk a little bit about the acetylcholine system and what it's involved with. The monoamines, this is a technical chemical term. Mono, of course, means one, right? Amines, you know what that means. It's an amino group. It's, it's part of every amino acid, right? So these are going to be actually manufactured from amino acids, but they're going to only include one amino group. So the reason I'm mentioning this, these include, for example, dopamine and norepinephrine, and also serotonin. These are neurotransmitters that are very important in terms of drugs that are used clinically and also drugs of abuse. The reason that they're all sort of listed together is that structurally they share some similarity. So it turns out that drugs that act at receptors for dopamine oftentimes will also influence receptors or other protein machines that are associated with norepinephrine. Dopamine and norepinephrine are monoamines that are even more closely related, right? They're more structurally related than serotonin is to dopamine and norepinephrine. All three of them are monoamines, but dopamine and norepinephrine are what we refer to as catecholamines. They actually have another structural similarity that makes them even, ties them even more closely together. It turns out that dopamine and norepinephrine are manufactured from the same amino acid, right? While serotonin, it'll turn out, is manufactured from a different amino acid. So the monoamines, which are going to be so important for our study of drugs, particularly, again, drugs of abuse, share certain structural similarities, and so do their receptors, and so do their transporters, and so do other protein machines that are associated with these systems. Again, dopamine and norepinephrine are more closely related to each other than serotonin. And then the last sort of classical neurotransmitter group is what we refer to as the amino acid neurotransmitters. These are the ones you don't hear about as much. But they really are the workhorse neurotransmitters of our central nervous system, of our nervous system in general, actually. They are glutamate and GABA. So while we hear a lot about dopamine and norepinephrine and serotonin and acetylcholine, the majority of neurotransmission, of synaptic transmission, chemical transmission at synapses in your nervous system, actually is handled by glutamate and by GABA. So we'll talk a little bit about those systems, or those transmitters as well. Now, I'm going to just really briefly mention non-classical neurotransmitters. And in this course, we don't have as much time to go into them. But it turns out that these classical neurotransmitters are not the whole story by far. There are a lot of other neurotransmitters that have been discovered in the nervous system, including many peptides. We will discuss these in reference to the opiate system and opiate drugs. Endorphins, you may have heard of, and enkephalins. There are also lipids. Actually, this we'll cover to some extent too, because it turns out that marijuana active ingredients in marijuana actually activate receptors that are associated with lipid neurotransmitters, with literally fat neurotransmitters that are released under certain conditions in your central nervous system and in your peripheral nervous system. And finally, there's been some interest in nitrous oxide. It's a gas, actually, that seems to influence receptors, particularly in the bloodstream or on capillary cells, But their gases are often sometimes used as neurotransmitters in your nervous system as well.